Our second session presents two talks representing the changing of the guard. Hockett both characterizes his own milieu and lays out what would be a path to the future. Holly's article is nothing short of a phonological manifesto. Both speakers in this session are past presidents of the North American Association for the History of the Language Sciences. Raúl Aranovich is professor of linguistics at the University of California, Davis. His interests are theoretical morphology and syntax and the history of linguistics. He combines these in his forthcoming chapter on the history of syntactic theories in the 20th century for the Elsevier International Encyclopedia of the History of Linguistics. And now, Raúl Aranovich, what's a distributionalist like you doing in a journal like Word on Hockett's two models of grammatical description?
Well, thank you, Peter. Hope everybody can hear me okay. Let me share the screen. So I was a little bit behind. So first of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity to present at this meeting. It is, I think, a great way to getting a sense of what Word and the ILA is. And honestly, I was not so familiarized with it. So it was a great chance for me to know more about the activities of this group and its history. So let's start by looking at a quote. A grammatical description must be a guidebook for the analysis of material in the language, both material examined by the analyst before the description was formulated and material observed after that. The description must also be prescriptive, not of course in the Fittich sense, but in the sense that by following the statements, one must be able to generate any number of utterances in the language above and beyond those observed in advance by the analyst. New utterances, most, if not all, of which will pass the test of casual acceptance by a native speaker. If you believe this quote comes from an early work by Noam Chomsky, you would be forgiven, okay? Because it actually comes from Charles Hockett's Two Models of Grammatical Description, published in Word, Volume 10 in 1954, and that's the topic of my presentation. The structure of the presentation is, or was planned to be, the biography of Charles Hockett, the structure of Two Models of Grammatical Description, and then looking at the relationship between Hockett and the journal Word, finally looking at the way in which syntactic structures used or misused two models of grammatical description. I'm gonna try to shorten the talk to fit in the allotted time. Hockett was born in 1916, died in 2000. His PhD is from 1939 at Yale with a dissertation on the grammar of Potawatomi. After that, he gravitated towards Bloomfield, of course, because of the Algonquian connection. He was Bloomfield's postdoctoral student at Chicago. And after World War II, quote, he became the preeminent linguist inspired by Leonard Bloomfield and the spokesperson for a distinctively US structural or descriptive linguistics, end quote. This is from his obituary by Michael Silverstein. He became a professor of linguistics and anthropology at Cornell from 1946 to 1982. And he was invited there by J. Milton Cowan, who was the LSA Treasury Secretary-Treasurer and also director of the Intensive Language Program. These two facts will become relevant later. I'll turn now to the structure of Two Models of Grammatical Description. This article introduces first an informal comparison between item and arrangement and item and process models. It formalizes both models, then discusses tactical and morphophonemic difficulties with item and arrangement models, and after a mathematical interlude, gives a formal comparison between the two models, and finally ends up talking about the evaluation of models. I'm gonna skip over some of these, especially the formalization of item and arrangement. I think that's probably what most people are familiar with. The two models, Hockett says, item and process is actually older. And some of the processes that have been talked about, especially in the Sapirian school, are affixation, apophony, etc. So this is a typical statement from a member of the school. In Tunica, prefixation and suffixation, particularly the latter, are exploited to a greater extent than are the other processes. So here what we see is two things: a kind of anthropomorphization of the language, right? Tunica exploits these resources or these processes, and also some kind of teleology. This is what the language is striving for. This is what the language wants to do or wants to be, right? The Bloomfieldian school and the post-Bloomfieldians like Harris, Bloch, Wells, and Naida later on, they were really dissatisfied with this and with the historical analogy between synchronic process and diachronic analysis. And they develop item and arrangement as just the list of the morphemes and the arrangements in which they occur relative to each other in utterances. We could try to translate an item and process statement into an item and arrangement process. It would look something like this, according to Hockett. Suffixes are more numerous, both as a class and as regards the average number per word than prefixes, and the latter in turn more numerous than infixes. But he says, Hockett says, there's something that's missing here. A lot of the insights about what the process is doing are lost in translation when we try to turn that into an item and arrangement analysis. And he says, if we're going to really compare the two analyses, the first thing we need to do is formalize item and process, because item and arrangement is already formalized in a way. So I'm going to skip through these slides and maybe go back with them when we talk about the formalization of item and process. What Hockett points out are the problems with the item and arrangement model. And he says the item and arrangement picture is therefore potentially somewhat more complex than originally emphasis on the two notions item and arrangement would imply, end quote. And he says that there are additional factors that we need to consider. Besides forms and linear order, which is the basic foundation of the model, we also have constructions and immediate constituency or hierarchical structure. The difference between forms and linear order is self-evident, and to identify hierarchical structure of immediate constituency as a factor, he gives the examples of ambiguities of the ones that we used to teach in Linguistics 1, right? Things like all men and women, which could be all men, women and all men, or all people, meaning men and women, right? He gives that little funny diagram to show that for the linguist, we could see both sides of these ambiguities. That would be figure B, but normal speakers in this geometrical metaphor only see A or C at any given time, right? The idea of a construction is really interesting. I think it's a new concept that he introduced in this discussion. I haven't seen it discussed before in the literature, or although maybe maybe my own ignorance. So he says that a construction is basically anything that is relational about a sentence or a form in more general terms that cannot be reduced to hierarchical structure, to immediate constituency. And he says there are, besides these structural ambiguities that we have seen already, as in all men and women, there are some other types of ambiguities that happen even when a form has a constant constituency structure. And this, he gives the example of Chinese Chao Fan, but we could also use Chomsky's later example of visiting relatives, as saying either relatives that are visiting us or the act of visiting other relatives. He says visiting relatives can be boring. That's one of his examples, right? So in visiting relatives, we have still the same constituent structure, but there's an ambiguity, and the ambiguity is relational. is visiting a modifier of relatives, or is relatives a complement of visiting, right? And for Hockett, that is what makes the constructional aspect of the item and arrangement process something that cannot be ignored if we're going to develop a model of grammar, right? There are also morphophonemic difficulties with item and arrangement. We're familiar with those now, especially if you are a practitioner of realizational morphology or word-based morphology. You know that replacive or apophonic morphology is problematic, the opposition between take and took. Subtractive morphology, going from bon to bon, and other cases, for instance, the ones that Hockett pointed out in Fijian, with Fijian transitive markers later on. And he says, if we, quote, modify our definition of morph in such a way as to allow subtractives and replacives, we remove the keystone of the whole item and arrangement arch. The model begins to collapse, end quote. And this is what he was able to see and suggest in this paper, I think. The alternative then is the item and process model. Let me go through the mathematical interlude, and because some of that will come back later, so we can review those quotes later. So in the formalization of the item and process model, he starts from stating what the basic form is. And he says the basic form is the root, not the morpheme, but the root. The root is, let's say, if we take a form like baked, the root is bake. But if we take a form like took, the root is take, even if it's not a morpheme exactly in there, right? He defines the grammatical pattern of a language as the sum of its morphophonemic and tactical patterns, just as item and arrangement does. The morphophonemic pattern is the statement of shapes, alternations, and conditions of alternation, very similar to what we do in item and arrangement. And also the alternation in shape or of roots in this model is also predictable. The tactical pattern, however, is different. He says that it's a list of the processes, not the constructions, not the items. It's a list of the processes with their positions. And for each position, a list of the roots, not the morphemes, but the roots and the processes that produce forms that occur there. So it's a lot more dynamic than the item and arrangement process. And processes, the output of processes can also be part of the specification of other processes, right? Then he continues. A derived form in the item and process model, is one or more underlying forms to which a process is applied. So notice this is really important. I put it in, boldface so that we can focus on that. One or more underlying forms. Whereas for the item and arrangement model, there's always, a constituent must always have two constituents, two or more constituents. In the item and a process model, you can start with a single root and the process will derive a derived form. Okay, and the mechanics of this are really interesting, really innovative. It's part of what makes this this article really so different from everything that was done before. Each underlying form occupies a position in the derived form. The underlying forms are or is the immediate constituents of the derived form, called the constitute, again, just as in item and arrangement process. So the comparison is direct. And an immediate constituent can be a root or a form that results from a process being its output. In order to understand how to derive forms like baked, and Hockett analyzes it as a unary process. So the idea is that we take bake as the root. It's the only constituent, really, of baked, the past tense. And the past tense, quote unquote, suffix, did or id, as we know, and the alternation, again, is going to be predictable more in the morphophonological sense. This past tense suffix is really what he calls a marker. A marker is phonemic material that is not part of any underlying form. It's not part of the root. It's not a separate morpheme. So what he's saying is, take the root bake, a process will turn that into the past tense. And as part of that process, it specifies that these phonemic material, id, or t in this case, is going to be added to whatever phonemic material comes with the root. This is really close to what we're doing these days in realizational morphology, right? Where the idea of the morpheme as a unit of sound and meaning has disappeared. There's no more morphemes. And it all goes back to Hockett. Hockett is, by doing this, he's saying, well, if you start talking about processes, you don't need the morpheme anymore because we don't need to arrange items. All we need to do is look at the output of these processes, which may specify their own changes or modifications to the phonetic material that comes with the root that that process is applied to. Very different mechanism. So the same thing can be applied to deriving took from take, right? It's just a process that changes the shape of the root. It doesn't need to, we don't need to think of it in terms of morphemes. There's no question about, are we adding a null morpheme that then causes the root to, change into an allomorph or thinking about suppletion or something like that. Took is just a different output for the same process of specifying the tense of that root, okay? Other types of processes that he identifies will give us the different constructions, such as predication, as in John saw, resolution, as in saw John or fried rice, modification, as in fried rice, or addition, as in John and Bill. Importantly, this new formalized model is not a Sapirian model. Even though Hockett said the item and process model goes all the way back to Sapir, what he is proposing is not a Sapirian model in different ways. For Sapir, there was no difference between tactics and morphophonemics. And for Sapir, more importantly, in the Sapirians, suffixation and apophony were different processes. They saw those as different morphophonemic processes. But for Hockett, it's the same process. The process is just saying, take that root, make it past tense, okay? And in the formalization of that process, we are specifying what the marker of that process is going to be. Could be addition of phonological material, as in baked, could be substitution or modification of existing material, as in take to took, could be subtraction of phonological material, could be clipping, and any kind of morphophonological exponent of that process is valid. It's always the same process, okay? So the advantages are that we have no superfluous tactical machinery, so we can recognize both baked and took as singular processes that take a single root and derive an inflected form. And in the case of apophony, as we said, there's no morphophonemic difficulties as assuming like zero morphs or anything like that. So it's quite convincing. There are some problems left, but the next step that Hockett takes, and he's very honest with himself and with us as readers, is to say, well, now we have two formalized models. How do we compare them? Which one is better? Which one is the right one? And he says, before we start comparing things, we need to have a list of the criteria for judging that a model is useful or valid. And that's what he says, well, we need our meta criteria that we're going to use for each model, criteria that tells us which criteria we need for each model in order to evaluate them, right? And if you know anything about Hockett, I believe, for what I know, he liked to list things. If you remember his work on language universals and animal languages and things like that, he always has this list of criteria that we need to look at. So we have 5 meta criteria for the evaluation of models: generality, specificity, inclusivity, productivity, and efficiency. And at the end, he says, neither item and arrangement nor item and process actually meet these meta criteria. We don't have criteria to judge them as valid yet, right? Quote, we must have more experimentation, as much with one model as with the other, and with the devising of further models too, for that matter, looking towards an eventual reintegration into a single, more nearly satisfactory model, but not forcing that reintegration until we are really ready for it, end quote. So that's the structure or what we are rescuing from two models of grammatical description so far. And now I want to look at the relationship between Hockett's contribution and the journal word. I'm going to talk a little about the linguistic circle of New York, then the journal word, and then what the title of my talk is. And thank you for letting me use it in spite of how tongue-in-cheek it sounds. What is a distribution? It's like you doing in a journal, like Word. Okay. So the Linguistic Circle of New York, which is the organ that published the journal Word, was created in 1943, as Peter told us, by linguists in exile in New York from Europe during the war, many of them coming from the Société de Linguistique de Paris. Roman Jakobson was the founder and manager behind the scenes for a long time, and it was housed, the meetings of the circle were housed at the École Libre de Haute Étude. You can see a picture of that to get a sense of what the atmosphere was around that time. And in 1969, it turned to the International Linguistic Association. There was a certain antagonism between this Linguistic Circle of New York and the Neo-Bloomfieldians, which were organized around the LSA and the journal language. There's also the infamous $2 bill incident in which members of the language section, which were the linguists employed by the army to develop these language manuals that you can see here, that they signed a $2 bill to send it to Roman Jakobson, telling him, use this to buy yourself a ticket back to Europe at the end of the war or something like that, right? There's several accounts of that event. So both the language section and the Neo-Bloomfieldians grouped around the LSA and language saw the European linguists that were coming into New York in exile from the war as arrogant and also threats to their own prospects of employment in academia in the future, right? We heard from Peter a little bit about the history of Word, how it turned from the bulletin of the Linguistic Circle into a full-fledged journal. André Martinet played a substantial role as editor from the time he arrived in New York. And the journal had a balance of European and some American scholars. And Martinet was responsible for most of the running the journal from 1948 onwards. Again, we see that there were open communications between the LSA and Word, between language and Word. They, according to Martinet, they exchange submissions when they felt that they were more appropriate for the other journal, right? But really, Word was launched by these linguists who felt that they had no space in the American academic universe, and that we being snubbed by language when they tried to submit their articles. This is true in particular in the case of Jakobson. Word was founded as an interdisciplinary and eclectic journal, and this is from Jakobson, cited in a recent article by Jean-Yves Destenois, and I'm not going to read the French quote. My French is still kind of atrocious, unfortunately. So what is a distributionalist like Hockett doing in this journal that was supposed to be the antithesis of language and what the Bloomfieldians were doing? We saw that Hockett was seen as the the poster boy for the Neo-Bloomfieldians, right? He was a prominent Bloomfieldian scholar, he was a member of the language section, right? He was the right hand man of Moxie Smith, of Trager and Smith fame, who was the one that was running the language section, and a close associate of J. Milton Cowan, who was LSA Secretary Treasurer and head of the Intensive Language Program, which was the civilian counterpart to the language section from the Army. So there's no reason he should have been in contact with Word at all. But Hockett was more interesting than that. He was more complex than that. If you know his history, you understand where we're going with this. He was a founding member of the Linguistic Circle of New York. And as were many members of the language section. Not all members of the language section were so ill disposed towards these European refugees, right? Robert Hall, Paul Benedict, a dozen more members of the language section are in the Linguistic Circle of New York too. And I quote, "After our military linguistic operations moved from Washington to New York, I came to know Roman Jakobson, who was at that time lecturing the École des Hautes Études. From him, as from so many of the others I have mentioned, I learned much more than I realized at the time." End quote. This is by Hockett's self-account of his history, his development as a linguist. Hockett was also an anthropologist. That was his training was in both disciplines. And he recognized the side of Bloomfield that few acknowledged. And I quote, "The Algonquian research eventually afforded me an exposure to Bloomfield's methods of an intimate sort relatively few have had. I can assure you that Bloomfield, known through both his general writings and his technical work on Algonquian, is very different from Bloomfield known only through the former. For example, although the general writings, at least when read with insufficient care, can lead one to believe that he considered meaning unimportant, the meticulous attention to semantic accuracy shown in his English translations of Algonquian text and in his Algonquian English lexicons give the lie to any such notion." End quote. Also, we have heard about how important this issue of Word is, the 1954 issue, that's volume 10, issues 2 and 3. That's where Zig Harris's paper appeared. Raúl and Wells contributed to it, as many European scholars like Henri Frey and Jenslev. And this was actually, I think what's behind this issue is something that's really, really interesting. This was Martinez's way of contributing to the bicentennial celebration of Columbia University. This was a grand affair. They really made it a big point of showing how this institution is here to stay and has a long history. They even gave Queen Elizabeth of England an honorary degree, and she was invited to participate in these celebrations. And so this call for unity, as Martinez calls it, was part of this larger event celebrating Columbia University, where Martinez was teaching. He also, in reflecting about this journal, he talks about, I'm not going to read this quote, but he talks about Hockett as moving towards a better grasp of paradigmatic realities, which he liked. And for Martinez, that means moving away from distributionalism, actually moving away from looking just at the syntagmatic as, let's try to identify first the phonemes, how they contribute to the morphemes by looking at their distribution, their environments, right? And let's start to look more at this vertical integration, this paradigmatic integration with other levels, including usage and meaning. So Martinez saw, or at least suspected, that later on, this was the direction in which Hockett was going, moving away from the limitations of the post-Bloomfield approach. So Hockett then was moving away from strict distributionalism. He's doing away with the morpheme in the item and process model. And he was insisting that process is something that models what speakers do more closely. And in that way, he was also distancing himself from Sapirian historicization of process. And he was really taking, I think, the field in quite a new direction. Okay. very interesting. So I have about a couple of minutes, or maybe I can extend a little bit longer to, I'm going to be short, try to be short, looking at the impact that two models of grammatical description had on syntactic theory later on, because it was one of the few works. Hockett is one of the few linguists that Chomsky cites with more or less frequency in syntactic structures. So I'm going to look at the relationship between word and generative grammar, and then at two models of grammatical description as a source for syntactic structures, and then the use of the term generate, which we saw in that initial quote, which is used pretty frequently in two models of grammatical description, and also in syntactic structures. So I think Peter had told us a little bit about the animosity between the members of the linguistic circle and the generativists. And the generativists thought they were going to be, their allies in this war against Bloomfieldian linguistics, but they were not. Martinet didn't really like Chomsky and generativism at all. So, but I'll go through that. In syntactic structures, two models of grammatical description is cited a few times. Hockett work is cited 8 times, all in footnotes, which is part of Chomsky's writing style. But some aspects of two models of grammatical description make their way into the manuscript. Chomsky uses Hockett's examples about ambiguity, both to support his idea for the need to have phrase structured grammar, to have phrase structures, immediate constituents, and also to separate phonology from morphology. He goes back to these evaluation criteria. Remember that this was really important for Chomsky. Chomsky thought that linguistic theory should not provide a way to discover the grammar of a language, but only a way to evaluate models or evaluate competing grammars about a language. So he uses the generality criteria from two models of grammatical description, just as Hockett proposed it. In morphophonology, Chomsky uses examples like apophony to argue again for the independence of levels, which is something that neither the Sapirians nor the neo-Bloomfieldians would approve of. But he takes objection to Hockett's remark that this model is insufficient when trying to explain the phonological similarities between take and took, or shake and shook, for that matter. Discontinuous morphemes also make their way into this discussion. But the important thing to me, that surprising thing, was that there is no mention of the concept of a process in syntactic structure, which is central to Hockett's analysis. For Hockett, process was the computational equivalent in formal terms of construction. And he said that when we look at mathematics, we can, and let me see, how are we doing for time?
You have about, it's maybe 32 minutes have elapsed. So, yeah.
Okay. Okay, so let me take a couple of minutes and run this up.
Yeah, of course.
So for Hockett, the notion of a process was linked to this idea of computation, right? And process was really for him more of a sort of a mental operation, right? And that's what he means by generate. He thinks about speakers generating language in the way that we would come up with the result of an equation by computing the numbers and the relations as a mental process, right? This is probably why the term generate is not, and Chomsky does not recognize that Hockett had used this term earlier in two models of grammatical description. We know Chomsky read two models of grammatical description, right? But he never says, well, my idea of a generative grammar is different from Hockett's. He just ignores it altogether, right? Because for Chomsky, the idea was more formal, right? He didn't care about actual speakers like Hockett did because of his anthropological training. Chomsky cared about the ideal speaker, and that was it, right? He didn't care about mental processes. He just cared about trying to formalize. This is what syntactic structures is all about. It's a formalization of the item and arrangement process, of the immediate constituent process. But in order to show that the limitations of the process, what the limitations of the process are, and why we need these additional kind of transformational structure. But Chomsky is still within the Bloomfieldian paradigm. He's just trying to make that paradigm a little better, more efficient. Whereas what we see with Hockett is that he's moving away from that, going in an entirely different direction. And in a way, I think Hockett was ahead of the time from where Chomsky was even a little bit later. So I think that's it. I don't have too much else in terms of conclusions. I'm going to stop here, and I hope that your questions and my attempt at answering them will bring this paper into better focus. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I want to open the floor to any remarks, questions. Peter, please begin. I see your hand up.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't have to go first, because my two questions are kind of tangential and about Martinet. The first is, if Word had not been interrupted for 4 years to publish the vast Martinet Festschrift, do you agree with my supposition that Word could have been the outlet for the early papers in generative semantics that now go by the title Notes from the Linguistic Underground, and even the Macaulay Festschrift for his 35th or 36th birthday, I think it's called?
I think so. So I'm trying to understand the history of Word, right? I think Mark, and you mentioned something about what are we supposed to pronounce it? Folks? Is that the right pronunciation? Fox. About how his his memorialization of his time at the around Word is not all that correct. I don't know. I mean, my sense is that it was the death of Uriel Weinreich that really was problematic for the history of Word, that interrupted the continuity. And then Martinet going back to France in 1955, moving with him, quote unquote, although he disputes that, the printing of Word from New York to France, right, to Europe. But I think it's very likely that if that what you're saying is correct, that Word could have been an outlet for more of the alternatives to generative linguistics, because it already had a tradition, right, as a journal that was sort of open and more eclectic and looking at integrating syntax with semantics and other aspects of language activity, definitely.
And the second one is, I don't know how old Martinet was when he wrote that memoir in 1994, but it's very crabby indeed. And he connects his leaving Columbia with their establishment of the Yiddish Studies Department for Weinreich and Lotz. And in light of today's university politics, I wonder if there's an undercurrent that is not stated that might have been in Martinet's attitudes.
Yeah, I want to be a little bit careful about that. When I read Martinet's account, what he was actually saying was that he was trying to protect the Yiddish department, that there was an endowment that was earmarked for the Yiddish, for the establishment of a Yiddish chair, and that a dean wanted to use that for something else when the donor died, but Martinet went to bat to make sure that that money was used for its original purpose, right? And that's why the dean didn't like him and forced him to go. So it's not that he was opposed to Yiddish, it's the opposite. That's what he says, right? On the other hand, I read somewhere like intimations that his antagonism towards Jacobson had a basis in a little bit of an anti-Semitic bent on his part. I don't know. I really don't know.
Great. Thank you.
Right. Richard, I think your hand was up second. Very close second to Peter's first.
Okay, thank you. I would like to say about three things about Hockett, and Peter asked us to share, well, more personal things. So I corresponded with Hockett a little bit, and I met him at a conference. He came out to the Linguistic Association of the Southwest meeting toward the very end of his life, and he changed his mind on things and said he was wrong. He gave a paper on phonemes as gestalts and said he had had the wrong approach before for all those years. He also, I sent him a copy of a paper about grammaticalization saying people were seeing it everywhere and it wasn't really everywhere. And he said, what's wrong with these people? Don't they realize that everything is a mixture of lexical and grammatical? So I liked your paper, but I'm not really doing linguistics anymore. I'm focusing on music. And of course, he had been in Cornell, and one of the worst attended LSA meetings was in Cornell in the deep winter, and maybe only like 3 people went because it was in 2 different cities, and one of them was much warmer than the other, even though it was winter. Maybe Hockett felt isolated, and going to New York gave him a contact that he wouldn't have had otherwise. But so Silverstein has a very mixed opinion. I had dinner with him once where he just held forth on Hockett, the late Michael Silverstein, and he said he wanted to be the one receiving the mantle of Bloomfield. And then Chomsky dethroned him, and that's one reason why he was so bitter. But yet he still then went on and did this other work. And Silverstein undercut him by saying, I looked in the documents of the Harvard Society of Fellows, and Bloomfield's recommendation for Hockett said, Mr. Hockett came to me and said, what Algonquian language needs working on? And I said, without hesitation, Potawatomi. And he went and he filled many notebooks, and they were very competent. Now, maybe that's high praise from Bloomfield, but Silverstein didn't think so. And a cryptic remark, this was Tom Wasso, who was at the LSA's 50th anniversary dinner, I guess it was in Amherst at the Institute in 1974. And he heard Hockett say, that terrible Noam Chomsky, for years he made me think the wrong thing about the Vietnam War. And you don't know. Was Hockett for the war because Chomsky was against it? Or did actually Hockett oppose the war to start with, and then he thought he didn't like Chomsky's argument, but somehow then he realized it was good. But he does mention word and paradigm, just very in passing in the paper. And
yes,
to me, that's the most processual of all the theories, because when it's word-based, when it's like Christianic derivation or parasitic derivation, then you start with a word and you really got to carve it up to get to the place you're going. And what's wild to me is that distributional morphology is kind of an amalgam of item and arrangement, where you have these positions, these sort of templatic slots, and yet you do processes there, but you don't have to really have anything to start with, just some semantic, morphosyntactic features. But Hockett was on top of, all 3 of those theories, which is pretty amazing for the time.
Yeah, I think that. Thank you for all of that and the background information. I didn't know how interesting Hockett was until I started to look at his whole production. Right, it's an arch that really starts at one end and it goes to the other end of the way we do linguistics. And there's this whole history about him trying to leave the LSA, founding the LACUS Forum, which is like a great acronym for what it is. And I don't know. I mean, when I was an undergraduate in Argentina, we used his manuals to study linguistics. That was what was being translated, and that's what we used, right? So he's really a very complex character, and I think his work, and especially his theoretical evolution, is something that bears more research. I wanted to say that in terms of Martinet, research into Martinet and the history of what he's done, Testenois just told me that Martinet's archive has been deposited at the in France, I think, at the main library, and it's uncatalogued. So I can share with people who want to know where it is, the information, because I think there's going to be stuff in there, letters and documents and whatnot, that's going to be very important to reconstruct this history. Just
one footnote about Martinet. So Greenberg, I think Greenberg someone should have been assigned Greenberg, because he had is the vowel consonant dichotomy universal in '62, and then later he had studies in the American English with Jenkins. But he said Jakobson had the right to go to the front of the room and comment after every talk at a linguistic circle meeting. And when he left, Martinet continued that, and people didn't think he deserved to do it and were resentful.
I read Greenberg's comment to that effect, and it contrasts with what Erica Reiner remembered about the Dobbs Ferry Universals Conference. She said he sat in the back of the room for the whole 3 days, and I think it was a Sunday morning on the last day of the conference. He came down from his room and did the magnificent summary presentation, which is printed in the book, covering every topic that had been covered in great and accurate detail. So those two pictures of Jakobson are quite opposed. Unfortunately, I never met him, because at the Golden Anniversary meeting of the LSA in New York in '74, the main speaker was Kurowowicz, who Michael Silverstein said had an accent in every language he spoke.
I think we have time for one more question. Baruch, yes, thanks for being patient. I see your hand up, Baruch Ashun.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. That was a very insightful presentation. I like it. My question is very simple. I've been at places where people attribute generative grammar to Chomsky. So what would be your reaction to
that? Can you repeat the question, please? You were cutting off.
My question is, I've been to places where people attribute generative grammar to Chomsky. But from a presentation, I saw that there's so many schools of thought. So what would be your reaction to that? People attributing generative grammar to Chomsky.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think, Chomsky is the father of generative grammar. He defined the goals, the reach, the methods. Syntactic structures is really revolutionary in that sense, and it created a school from a sociological point of view, which Hockett did not have. And also, as I tried to say, even though Hockett uses the term generate a lot in Two Models of Grammatical Description, which was surprising to me, right? He uses it in a different way than what Chomsky would have liked. For Hockett, really, generate means it has the implications of a mental process, right? More on the psychological side of things, of what speakers actually do when they are talking and speaking. So, for instance, even just taking two forms, putting them together to form a constituent, that's a process, and that's part of the generative activity of language. Chomsky takes a different stand. For Chomsky, generate means, has a formal definition, which is define the extent of the language to distinguish the grammatical from the ungrammatical sentences, right? In the way that we may have a generator as a mathematical operator that can define the series of natural numbers based on the operations of, the initial 0 and 1 and successor of adding 1, 2. So it's more of a formal, disembodied notion of generate. And the idea of that the purpose of linguistics is to separate the grammatical from the ungrammatical sentences, moreover, assign to each of those sentences a structure that represents its properties. Chomsky was the first one to say that in a clear and explicit way. You don't find that in Hockett, right? Hockett is still trying to think about what do we do when we're trying to discover and justify the grammar of a language working in the field or working with documents from a particular language. It's very different from the way in which Chomsky took the field. I hope that answers the question.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aranovich, for this talk and this enlightening discussion. I think it's going to be time now to move to the second speaker for this session. Peter, if you would like to introduce Dr. Richard Janda.